The morning Evelyn Hart was led to the auction platform, the sky above Blackstone Crossing was the color of a bruise, tall, purple and greenish-gray along the ridgeline, with a pale strip of cold light just beginning to crack the eastern horizon. It was the kind of sky that promised nothing good. She had not slept. There wasn't much point in sleeping when you already knew what morning was going to bring. They had come to the boarding house door just after sundown the night before. Two men sent by Aldous Crane, the town's primary creditor, along with a deputy who held a folded document in one hand and kept his other hand resting on the butt of his revolver as though he expected a fight. Evelyn had not given him one. There was nothing left in her to fight with, not that night. She had opened the door with Noah on her hip and stared at them through the gap and listened while the deputy read from the paper in a flat, formal voice that turned her entire life into a list of numbers. Her late husband, Thomas Hart, had died owing Aldous Crane $412. He had died owing the boarding house owner, a pinched woman named Mrs. Folger, another 60. He had died owing the feed merchant, the saddle maker, and at least two private individuals whose names Evelyn had never heard before. The total, the deputy explained without ever meeting her eyes, came to $573.40. The estate, meaning everything Thomas had owned at the time of his death, which amounted to 2 horses, a broken wagon, a handful of tools, and their remaining personal effects, had already been seized and assessed. It covered barely half. What remained unpaid, the deputy said, would need to be settled by other means. He did not explain what other means were. He did not have to. Evelyn already knew. She had heard about it happening to a woman over in the Harrow Valley the previous spring, a widow with no family and no resources who had ended up indentured to a merchant's household for 2 years just to clear her dead father's debts. She had told herself at the time that it was a terrible thing, the way the frontier could swallow a person whole. She had not imagined telling herself that while standing in her own doorway with her sleeping son against her shoulder. She asked if she could have until morning to make arrangements. The deputy said that was fine, but that someone would come for her at 8 o'clock. She spent the night sitting in the room's single chair, not crying. She had cried herself dry in the 3 days after Thomas's funeral, and there was nothing left. Just sitting with Noah in her lap, watching the candle burn down, trying to think of something she could do. There was no family to wire. Her parents were gone. Thomas's family had never accepted her and would not accept a grandson they'd never met. The women in town who might have helped were the wives of the men who owed Aldous Crane favors. The preacher was a good man, but poor. There was no bank that would lend money to a widow with no collateral and no history in the territory. By the time the candle guttered out, Evelyn had accepted that she was out of options. She dressed Noah in his warmest clothes before she dressed herself, because the morning was cold and she did not know where they would end up by nightfall. She braided her hair tightly, pinned it, and put on the same dark dress she had worn to Thomas's burial, because it was the least worn of what she owned. She did not want to look defeated, even if she was. When the deputy's knock came at 8, she opened the door without hesitating. The walk to the main street was not long. Blackstone Crossing was not a large town, barely 2 parallel streets and a scatter of outbuildings working their way up the lower slopes of the Cutter Range. But it felt long to Evelyn, with people already gathered on the boardwalks and in doorways, watching. She recognized most of their faces. She had shopped in their stores. She had attended the same social evenings in the months since she and Thomas had arrived in town, trying to build something out here on the edge of everything. They watched her now the way you watch something that's already happened, with a kind of settled curiosity that has no room in it for discomfort. The platform was a repurposed loading dock outside Crane's general store, wide, solid, about 3 steps up from the street. Aldous Crane himself stood at the edge of it when they arrived, talking to a man Evelyn didn't recognize. Crane was a compact, well-dressed man in his 50s with a silver watch chain across his vest, and the manner of someone who had never once in his adult life been told he couldn't have something he wanted. He glanced at Evelyn when she came up, gave Noah a brief, dismissive look, and went back to his conversation. There were perhaps 30 men in the street, maybe a few more. Some of them Evelyn knew by name: Harlan Price, who ran the livery and had always been pleasant enough; the Dobbins brothers, who were not pleasant; a cattle buyer from out of the valley named Sutter, who had a reputation for acquiring things cheaply and working them hard; a few she didn't know at all. They were not a howling mob. That was almost the worst part of it. They stood around in the cool morning air with their hats in their hands, or their thumbs in their belt loops, talking among themselves, occasionally glancing at the platform, like men waiting for an ordinary transaction to begin. An auctioneer named Briggs, a traveling man who worked the livestock sales and apparently had no objection to other kinds of business, climbed up to the platform, shuffled his papers, and called the crowd to order. Evelyn stood to one side with the deputy beside her, holding Noah against her chest, and tried to keep her face blank. Noah was awake and quiet, which she was grateful for, his dark eyes moving around at the gathered men and the storefronts with the uncomplicated attention of a child who does not yet know enough to be afraid. "Ladies and gentlemen," Briggs began, and then seemed to realize that the term was awkward, given the circumstances, and cleared his throat. "We are here to settle the outstanding debts of the late Thomas Hart, deceased, through the arrangement of—" "Just get to it," someone in the crowd called out. Briggs got to it. The arrangement, as he explained it, was a form of labor indenture, not uncommon in the territory, technically within the bounds of the territorial statutes. Though Evelyn had noticed that Briggs seemed to be reading from a document that Crane's own clerk had likely prepared rather than any official legal code. Whoever paid the remaining debt would be owed 2 years of domestic service in return. The child would accompany the mother. The terms were to be agreed upon between the winning party and the creditor. Evelyn listened to all of this and kept her eyes on the mountains. The bidding started at $150. Harlan Price opened at $175, and Evelyn felt her stomach drop even though she had known this was coming, because there was something about hearing your name attached to a number that made it real in a way that sitting up all night thinking about it had not managed to. The Dobbins brothers bid against each other for a while, apparently more out of habit than any clear desire, before the older one settled on $220. The cattle buyer Sutter came in at $250 with the flat, practiced expression of a man used to acquiring things at auction, and something in his eyes when they moved to Evelyn made her hold Noah slightly tighter without quite meaning to. It went back and forth, numbers rising, Briggs calling out bids in a practiced rhythm. The crowd watching with the same detached attention. Evelyn kept counting her breaths, in through her nose, out through her mouth, slowly, because if she let herself feel everything that was happening right now, she would come apart in the middle of this street in front of everyone who had ever smiled at her at a church social, and she had decided last night, alone in the dark, that she was not going to give them that. Sutter came in at $310. Briggs let the pause stretch out. $310. Do I hear $320? The hoofbeats came from the northern end of the street. One horse, moving at a controlled canter, not frantic but deliberate. The pace of someone who has somewhere specific to be and intends to get there. The crowd shifted and turned, and Evelyn turned too, and saw a man on a big gray horse coming down the center of the main street at a pace that made people move out of his way without him asking them to. He was not a young man. Somewhere in his late 30s or early 40s, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of build that comes from years of actual labor rather than the groomed muscularity of vanity. His coat was heavy canvas, worn at the elbows, and his hat was pulled low against the morning cold. There was a scar along the left side of his jaw. Not dramatic, just a permanent white line that caught the flat winter light. And his hands on the reins were the hands of someone who had worked hard for a long time. He pulled the horse up at the edge of the gathered crowd and sat there a moment, looking at the platform, looking at Briggs, looking at Evelyn. His expression was not readable. Not angry, not pitying, just the careful stillness of a man taking inventory of a situation. Then he swung down from the horse, wrapped the reins around the hitching post with 2 practiced loops, and walked toward the platform. People moved, not because he pushed them, but because there was something about the way he moved through a crowd that made space appear in front of him. "What's the full figure?" he said to Briggs. He didn't raise his voice. It carried anyway. Briggs blinked. "I'm sorry?" "The total debt outstanding. What's the number?" Crane stepped forward from where he'd been standing at the edge of the platform, his expression shifting to something that was not quite welcome and not quite challenge. "Sir, I'm not certain this is—" I asked what the number was. Still the same quiet voice. He was looking at Briggs, not Crane. Briggs looked at his papers. $573.40 total. Against the estate's assessed value, the remaining balance is $286. The man had done the math before Briggs could finish. $282, actually, Briggs said, checking his figures. $282 and change. The man reached into his coat. He pulled out a leather wallet that was not fat but was solid, and he counted bills onto the edge of the platform without ceremony or drama, counted them out slowly, making sure Briggs could see each one, then set a small collection of coins on top. "That's $290, he said. "Take the full debt out of it and give the woman back whatever's left." The street had gone very quiet. Aldous Crane's face had done something complicated. "Now, see here. This isn't how this arrangement works. The bidding was for the balance of the debt." The man looked at Crane for the first time, and whatever was in his expression made Crane stop talking. "I've paid the balance of the debt, the full balance, plus a few dollars over. If you want to contest that in front of a territorial judge, I'll stand in a courtroom and explain the math to him." A pause. "Will you?" Crane's jaw tightened. He looked at his clerk, who looked at Briggs, who looked at the money sitting on the edge of the platform. "That is the full amount," Briggs said, more quietly than before. The man nodded once and turned back to face the crowd, and then, for the first time, looked directly at Evelyn. "Ma'am," he said, "my name is Cole Mercer. I've got a ranch about 12 miles north of here, up in the Cutter Range. It's not much, but it's solid and it's paid for." He stopped there, like he was trying to figure out the right words and wasn't entirely finding them. "I'm not asking for anything in return. I want to make that plain. But if you and the boy have nowhere else to go, you're welcome there until you can get on your feet." Evelyn stared at him. Around her, the crowd was murmuring not loudly, just that low collective sound of people processing something unexpected. She was aware of Crane's irritation radiating from the platform like heat. She was aware of the Dobbins brothers exchanging a look. She was aware of about 30 pairs of eyes on her, waiting to see what she would do. She looked at the man named Cole Mercer, at his scarred jaw and his worn coat and the careful, neutral expression that gave away almost nothing, and tried to find the angle in it, because there had to be an angle. Because men did not ride into towns and spend $290 on strangers without wanting something. She could not find the angle. That frightened her more than finding one would have. But behind her there was Aldous Crane with a transaction that had just been disrupted and a mood that was not going to improve. In front of her, in the street, were Sutter and the Dobbins brothers and a collection of other men whose interest in her, whatever its shape, was not likely to be the kind she could live with. And in her arms was Noah, who had started to fuss softly in the way that meant he was hungry. "All right," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. "All right, Mr. Mercer." He nodded. No smile, no expression of satisfaction, nothing that looked like winning. Just a nod, and then he turned back toward his horse. Crane tried once more, something about contracts and the proper structure of the arrangement, and Cole said, without turning around, "Bill me for anything the law says you're owed. I'll be in Blackstone Crossing again in 3 weeks." He untied the horse and led it back toward Evelyn. "That's my gray. She won't spook." Evelyn had not been on a horse since before Noah was born. She shifted the baby in her arms, looked at the animal, and looked at Cole. "I'll need a moment to get my things from the boarding house. Take whatever time you need." He stood with the horse while she went back to the room, the deputy making no effort to stop her now that the debt was settled, and she packed everything she owned into the single traveling trunk she'd arrived in Blackstone Crossing with, which was not a lot. A few dresses, Noah's things, the small locked box where she kept the letters from her mother, dead 6 years, Thomas's pocket watch, which she had kept because it was the only thing of his she could stand to look at. When she came back out, Cole loaded the trunk onto the horse without comment, then helped her up into the saddle. He handed Noah up to her once she was settled, then took the reins and led the horse up the street on foot. "You're not riding," she said. "She's carrying enough." He said it without any particular inflection. They left Blackstone Crossing on foot and horseback, Cole walking ahead, Evelyn in the saddle with Noah, and the cluster of townspeople watching them go from the boardwalk like something was being settled they hadn't expected to see settled that way. It was cold. The mountains ahead were white along the ridgeline, and the track north of town was just 2 ruts in frozen ground, climbing slowly into the timber. Evelyn could feel Noah's warmth against her chest and the cold of the air against her face, and she looked at the back of the man walking ahead of her, at the set of his shoulders, the way he walked, steady and unhurried, and tried to figure out what she had just agreed to. She did not trust him. She wanted to be clear with herself about that. A man who spent nearly $300 to stop an auction could afford to do it as a calculation, and she had no way of knowing yet what his calculation was. The fact that he had said he wanted nothing in return did not mean anything. Men said things. But he had not asked her to thank him, had not looked at her the way Sutter had looked at her, had not said anything about what he expected, had just said she and Noah were welcome until they could get on their feet, and then had walked ahead of her without looking back to see if she was watching him. She watched him anyway. "How long have you been on that ranch?" she called out, because the silence was becoming its own kind of pressure. He glanced back without slowing. 7 years. Alone? A pause. Pretty much. "That's a long time to be alone," she said, and then wished she hadn't, because it sounded like she was implying something. Cole didn't respond to it one way or another. He just kept walking. The track rose gradually into the foothills, the scrub giving way to pine and then to denser timber as they climbed. The temperature dropped as they gained elevation. Noah had fallen asleep against Evelyn's chest, which was a mercy. He was a good baby, better than she deserved given everything, and she had spent most of the past week terrified of what would happen to him if she couldn't hold things together. "There's a creek crossing about a mile up," Cole said, without turning. "Frozen solid right now, so it won't be a problem, but the gray'll want to slow down on the ice. Let her. All right? And if you start to feel cold in your feet, say something. It's a long way to frostbite from numb toes, but I'd rather not find out the hard way." She almost said she was fine. "My feet are already fairly cold," she said instead, which was true. He stopped walking, reached into his saddlebag, and pulled out a length of wool blanket that had been stuffed in there. "Wrap this around them. It's not much, but it'll help." She took it. It smelled like horse and cedar smoke and something she couldn't identify, and it was warm from sitting against the horse's side. She tucked it around her lower legs and feet and felt the difference almost immediately. They went on. The mountains moved closer, or seemed to, though she knew it was just the track climbing toward them. The sky above the ridgeline was still that bruised, uncertain color, and she watched it and thought about Thomas. She had loved Thomas, or something close enough to it. She had certainly tried. He had been a handsome man, charming in a way that could make you forget to look carefully at what was underneath the charm. And she had not looked carefully enough, not until they were already here and already deep in debt to Aldous Crane and several others. And Thomas was telling her it would all come right, the land would pay out. Just wait, just be patient. He had believed it when he said it. She was fairly sure of that. He was not a man who knew how to recognize his own limits, which was different from being a man who lied. It didn't change where they'd ended up, but it changed something about how she felt about it. She did not feel much about it right now, she realized. She felt tired and cold despite the blanket, and the thing that sat in her chest whenever she thought about what had just happened in that street in Blackstone Crossing was not grief or shame, but a dense, exhausted anger that she didn't have anywhere to put yet. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "Cole," he said, still walking. "Cole." She tested the word. It felt informal in a way that was slightly unsettling. "Were you in Blackstone Crossing on business this morning, or did you come specifically for—" She stopped, because that sentence did not have a good ending. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "I was coming through. On my way back from the lower range, I heard from a man at the supply post what was happening. And you decided to intervene. I decided I wasn't going to watch that happen. Why?" This time the silence stretched longer. The horse's hooves were steady on the frozen ground. Noah breathed against her collar, that soft, warm rhythm that she had spent the past 3 months learning to read like a language. "I saw things during the war," Cole said finally, not looking back. "Things that a man doesn't get to unsee. After a while, you start to measure yourself by whether you act on what you know is wrong or whether you find a reason not to." He paused. "I had the money. That seemed like a reason enough." Evelyn looked at the scar along his jaw, visible even from the saddle when he turned his head slightly. "Which war?" she asked. "Does it matter?" She thought about it. "No," she said. "I suppose not." They rode on in silence. The timber closed around them, and the town dropped out of sight below. And after a while, there was nothing to see in any direction but pines and rock and the white edge of the mountains ahead. And it occurred to Evelyn that she was trusting her life and her son's life to a man she had known for approximately 2 hours, which was perhaps the most reckless thing she had ever done. She had not had much occasion for recklessness before. It felt strange, not entirely bad. The ranch came into view around midday, set in a natural clearing where the timber opened up and a wide creek ran along the eastern edge, frozen now and silent. The cabin was larger than she had expected. 2 rooms at least, maybe 3, built from timber that had darkened with years and weather, with a solid roof and a stone chimney from which a thin thread of smoke was rising. There was a barn, well built, and a fenced pasture, empty now in the cold. A woodpile that ran the length of the cabin's north wall, stacked nearly to the roofline. It was not pretty. It was built by someone who cared about things lasting, not things looking like they lasted. Cole tied off the horse at the barn door and helped Evelyn down from the saddle, taking Noah while she found her feet, which had gone partly numb despite the blanket. He held the baby with the careful, slightly stiff attention of someone who had not held one before but was determined not to let that show. "The cabin's warm," he said. "I left the stove burning when I came down this morning. There's food, not much that's ready, but there's salt pork and potatoes and a pot on the stove." "I can cook," Evelyn said, taking Noah back. She stopped. She had been about to say she was used to it, which was true, but was also the kind of thing you said when you were trying to make yourself useful, and she was not sure yet whether she wanted to be useful in the way that sounded. Cole didn't press it. "Settle in first. Eat something. The rest can wait." He took the trunk from the horse and carried it to the cabin without being asked. She followed him up the 2 wooden steps to the door, ducked inside, and stood in the dimness and the warmth for a moment, just standing. The cabin was spare but clean. A table with 2 chairs, a wood stove that ticked and breathed with heat, shelves along one wall with neatly stored supplies, a single bunk along the far wall, a second door that she guessed led to another room. "You can have the back room," Cole said, setting the trunk down. "I'll take the floor out here." "That's your bed," she said. It was. "Now it's yours." He said it like that settled something and went back outside to see to the horse. Evelyn stood in the middle of the cabin with Noah in her arms and looked around at this place she had never seen before, belonging to a man she did not know, 12 miles up a mountain in the middle of winter. Everything she owned was in that trunk. The only money she had was the $8 that had been returned to her from Cole's overpayment, $8.40, which was not nothing but was not enough for anything. She sat down carefully in one of the chairs, Noah against her shoulder, and looked at the fire through the grate of the wood stove. Outside she could hear Cole moving around, the sounds of a man going about the ordinary work of a ranch in the cold. The barn door, the stamp and shift of the horse, the methodical sounds of feeding and watering and settling. Ordinary sounds. The kind of sounds that had existed in her life before, and were utterly absent in the boarding house room where she had spent the past week. Noah made a small, content sound and went limp against her, asleep again. Evelyn reached up with one hand and pressed it flat against the side of his head, feeling the warmth of him. She did not know what Cole Mercer wanted. She did not know whether the absence of apparent motive was genuinely the absence of a motive or just the most sophisticated version of one. She did not know whether she had made a mistake or avoided one, coming up here. She knew almost nothing about this situation except that it was warmer than the street in Blackstone Crossing, and Noah was asleep. And $8 was not enough, but it was something. And somewhere outside a man was doing barn chores in the cold, after paying nearly $300 for the privilege. She stayed very still. The stove ticked. The baby breathed. Whatever came next, she decided she would deal with it when it came. She had been dealing with things as they came for most of her adult life, and she was still here, still upright, still holding her son. That was something. That had to be enough, for now. The first week was the hardest, and not for the reasons Evelyn had expected. She had expected the cold. She had expected the isolation. 12 miles of frozen track between the ranch and the nearest town, with nothing in between but timber and rock and the occasional sound of something moving in the dark beyond the tree line. She had expected the physical work, which was relentless in the way that all frontier homesteading was relentless. The kind of labor that did not stop because you were tired or sad or running on 4 hours of sleep, because your infant son had decided that 2 in the morning was an excellent time to be awake and vocal about it. What she had not expected was the silence. Not the silence of the mountains, which was not silence at all. There was always wind, always the creek, Always the tick of the wood stove and the sound of the horses moving in the barn and the small architectural complaints of the cabin in the cold. What she had not expected was the silence of Cole Mercer himself, which was a different kind of thing entirely. He was not unfriendly, he was not cold or cutting or the kind of quiet that had a threat in it. He was simply a man who had lived alone for 7 years and had organized his life around the absence of another person, and her arrival had disrupted every system he had without him showing anything about it on his face. He went about his work. He was there at the meals they ate at the same table, speaking when he had something to say, and not speaking when he didn't. He never lingered. He never asked questions that felt like probing. He looked at Noah with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not indifference, not warmth exactly, just a kind of careful attention, like a man watching something he didn't fully understand but was not going to pretend not to notice. She watched him watching Noah and tried to decide what that meant, and came to no useful conclusion. On the third morning, she woke before dawn to find the stove already banked and a pot of water heated on the grate. Not boiling, just warm enough for washing the baby, which was exactly the temperature you needed and which she had mentioned once to no one in particular the afternoon before. She stood in the dimness of the back room with the warm pot in her hand and thought about that for a while. She did not say anything about it at breakfast. He did not say anything either, which might have been modesty or might have been that he genuinely didn't think it was worth remarking on, and she could not tell which. The work settled into a shape during that first week. Evelyn took over the cooking entirely, not because he asked her to, but because she needed something to do with her hands. And because the potatoes and salt pork situation, while functional, was grim. She found dried beans in the stores and a small sack of cornmeal and onions hanging in the cold room, and she made things that were not remarkable but were considerably better than what had apparently been happening in that kitchen before she arrived. Cole ate what she put in front of him without comment for 2 days, and on the third evening he set down his fork and said, "That's the best thing I've eaten since probably the spring of '69, which she suspected was not an exaggeration. "That's a sad statement," she said. "It is," he agreed, and went back to eating. She did the laundry, though the cold made it miserable. Heating water, scrubbing, hanging things by the stove to dry because nothing would dry outside. She swept. She kept the stove fed when Cole was out working the property. She tended to Noah through his feeding schedules and his fussing and the small consuming demands of infancy that did not pause for weather or grief or circumstance. Cole, for his part, did everything outside. He cut wood. There was always more wood to cut, apparently, which she was beginning to understand was not a frontier exaggeration, and repaired fence line and checked on the horses and did the 100 small maintenance tasks that a ranch in winter required. He came in at midday with cold in his coat and mud on his boots, and ate and went back out again. On the 5th day, the water line to the barn froze. She heard him working on it for about 2 hours before she pulled on her heaviest coat and went outside to see if there was anything she could do to help. He was lying on his side in the frozen mud under the barn's east wall, working at a pipe connection with hands that had to be numb by then, and he looked up at her with an expression that was somewhere between irritation and genuine surprise. "You don't need to be out here," he said. "I know." She crouched down. "What do you need?" A pause. "There's a wrench on the shelf inside the barn door, the big one with the red handle." She got the wrench. She held things when he asked her to hold them, and passed him what he needed and did not make conversation. And by the time they had the line cleared and the connection reseated, her fingers were aching with cold and there was mud down the front of her coat. Cole sat up from the ground and looked at the state of her and said nothing about it, which she appreciated. "Thank you," he said. "It was a 2-person job," she said. "Most of them are." He said it without any particular weight, just as a statement, and pushed himself to his feet. They went inside. She made coffee. He sat at the table and wrapped both hands around the cup without drinking it for a long moment, just letting the warmth soak in, and she noticed that his hands were not in good shape. The knuckles were swollen, and there was a long-healed cut across his right palm that had not healed quite straight. The hands of someone who had been doing hard work for a long time without anyone to notice when he was hurt. She thought about saying something and decided not to. The days moved forward with the mechanical persistence of winter days, each one identical in structure if not in detail. The cold deepened as they moved further into January. Snow came twice. Not blizzard conditions, just steady, heavy falls that buried the woodpile and the fence posts and required hours of work just to keep the essential paths clear. Cole worked in it without complaint and came in covered in snow and dripping, and Evelyn learned to have dry socks warming by the stove without being asked. She was angry during those weeks. Not at Cole particularly, though he was occasionally the nearest available target. At Thomas, who had left her in this situation. At herself for not seeing it coming. At the whole arrangement of the world that had landed her on an auction platform in a frontier town at the mercy of strangers, through no failure of her own that she could identify except the failure of not having money and not having family and not having the kind of protection that the territory extended freely to men and almost never to women who were on their own. She was angry, and she had nowhere to put it, and so it came out in sideways moments, a sharpness in her voice when she was tired, a door that got closed harder than it needed to be, a long silence at dinner that was not comfortable in the way Cole's silences were comfortable but had a pressure in it. One evening, maybe 2.5 weeks in, she was washing dishes and something slipped. A cup, just a tin cup, nothing valuable. And it hit the floor and she stood there looking at it and felt the anger rise so hard and fast in her chest that she pressed both hands flat on the edge of the wash basin and breathed through it with her teeth clenched. She heard Cole come in from outside. Heard him stop. "Evelyn?" "I'm fine," she said, which was the biggest lie she had told since arriving. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "No, you're not." She picked up the cup, set it on the shelf. "I said I'm fine." "You've been fine for 3 weeks," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not challenge and not sympathy exactly, just a plain, level observation. "Seems like a long time to be fine." She turned around. He was standing just inside the doorway with snow melting off his hat, looking at her with the same careful attention he turned on everything. "What do you want me to do?" she said. "Fall apart? I have a 4-month-old son and no money, and I'm living in a stranger's house in the middle of the mountains. If I fall apart, who takes care of him?" "I'd take care of him," Cole said. The simplicity of it caught her off guard. She stared at him. He looked back at her without any particular expression, just meaning it plainly and without drama. She turned back to the dishes. "I don't want to fall apart," she said, more quietly. "All right," he said, and went about his business and did not push. But something shifted slightly after that. Not dramatically. There was no conversation that resolved everything, no moment of catharsis, just a very small relaxation of something she had been holding rigid, some awareness that the man on the other side of this house was not waiting for her to fail. She started to watch him more carefully, not with suspicion exactly, though suspicion was still there, more a habit now than a conviction. She watched the way he was with the horses, patient to a degree that surprised her, talking to them sometimes in a low voice she could not quite hear from the barn door. She watched how he handled problems, which was methodically and without drama, taking each thing as it came, not catastrophizing, not pretending it wasn't happening. She watched how he ate, which was without ceremony, but not without attention. He noticed when food was good, and there was something in the way he ate a decent meal that suggested he had eaten some very bad ones. One afternoon she asked him about the war, obliquely, not the direct question she'd tried and abandoned on the trail up to the ranch. She asked how old he'd been. 19 when I enlisted, he said. He was oiling a harness at the table. 23 when it was over. And after? Drifted for a while. Worked cattle drives. Tried a few things that didn't work. He smoothed the leather with his thumb. Ended up here. Did you choose it? This particular place? He thought about it. I came through in late fall and the snow had just come, and I looked up at those ridges and thought, that's something I could stand to look at for a long time. He shrugged, slightly self-conscious about what had sounded like sentiment. So I stayed. Evelyn looked at the window, at the line of mountains visible above the tree line, white and enormous in the afternoon light. She understood that, more than she might have expected. My husband used to say the land would provide, she said, if you just worked hard enough and believed in it enough. Cole was quiet for a moment. The land doesn't care what you believe, he said. It just is what it is. You work with what it gives you. That's a less romantic view. Probably more useful, though. She looked at him. He was looking down at the harness, working at a cracked section of leather with careful hands. She thought, not for the first time, but more clearly than before, that this was not a man who dealt in performance. He did not perform patience or generosity or steadiness. He simply had those things quietly and expressed them through what he did and not what he said about himself. It was a different kind of man than she had known before. She was not sure yet what to do with that. February arrived with a cold that was a different thing from January's cold, harder, drier, the kind that cracked wood and froze the hinges on the barn door and got into your lungs if you breathed too quickly. Cole made 2 trips down to Blackstone Crossing for supplies during those weeks, and each time he asked Evelyn if she needed anything, and each time she gave him a short list, thread, a particular kind of soap, a small item for Noah. And each time he returned with the list items plus something she hadn't asked for but turned out to need. A better grade of lantern oil when hers kept smoking, an extra blanket in the weeks before Noah outgrew being bundled against her warmth. She mentioned once that the spare room's window let in cold air along the sill. He stuffed it with rags the same afternoon, then spent the following morning adding a second layer of battening across the outside of the frame. She watched him from inside, through the glass, working in the cold with his breath fogging in the air around him. He did not tell her he was doing it. He just did it. There was a night in mid-February when Noah spiked a fever. It came on fast, the way infant fevers did. Nothing. And then suddenly too much heat in that small body, and Noah went from fussy to worryingly limp over the course of about 2 hours. Evelyn had dealt with fevers before, had gone through the same panic with Thomas once, and had the remedies her mother had taught her. But there was something about managing it alone in a cabin 12 miles from anywhere that made her hands shake when she was wringing out cloths. She did not mean to wake Cole. She was trying to be quiet, moving between the back room and the kitchen, heating water, keeping her voice low when she talked to Noah. But at some point, 2 in the morning, maybe, or 3, she heard movement in the front room, and then Cole appeared in the doorway in his long underwear, with his hair shoved to one side from sleeping, taking in the scene with the immediate focus of someone who goes from sleep to alert without a lag. "How bad?" he said. "Not bad enough to... I don't think we need to..." She pressed the cloth to Noah's forehead. "He's breathing fine. It's the fever that worries me." Cole came in and crouched beside the bunk, looking at Noah with that careful, full attention expression. He reached out and laid the back of his hand against the baby's cheek, gently, and Evelyn noticed that he did it without hesitating. No awkwardness, just a direct assessment. "Has it peaked yet?" "I don't know. Maybe an hour ago it seemed higher." "Okay." He stood up. "I'll keep the stove fed so you don't have to go back and forth. You stay with him." "You don't have to." "I know." He went to the stove. He stayed up for the rest of the night. He didn't hover. He understood that she needed space to work and worry in, that an audience made it worse, not better. He sat in the chair by the front room stove and kept it fed, and occasionally brought her fresh cloth water without being asked. And by morning, Noah's fever had broken, and the baby was fussy and hungry and absolutely furious about his interrupted sleep, which was the best possible sign. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bunk with Noah nursing and let out a breath that she felt had been held since somewhere around midnight. Cole looked in from the doorway. "He's all right?" "He's angry," she said, "which means he's fine." Cole made a sound that was not quite a laugh, something short and quiet that she'd come to recognize as the closest he got to one. "Good," he said, and went to make coffee. She sat there listening to the sounds of him moving in the kitchen. Water, the clink of the pot, the small ordinary sounds of morning, and felt something happen in her chest that she did not immediately have a name for. It was not gratitude exactly, though it included that. It was more like the sudden awareness of how long she had been braced for the fall, for the moment when the bill came due, for whatever it was that this situation was going to ask of her that she wasn't going to want to give, and the fall had not come. She was still waiting for it. She was not sure she knew how to stop. In the 3rd week of February, one of Cole's 2 horses came up lame, a front tendon, the kind of injury that healed, but healed slowly if you did it wrong. Cole spent 3 evenings wrapping and rewrapping the leg with the methodical attention he brought to everything, and Evelyn found herself sitting in the barn with him on the 2nd evening, holding the lantern, not because she had been asked, but because the light inside the barn was poor, and 2 people were better than 1. "You know horses," he asked, not looking up from the wrapping. Some. My father kept a small stable. Where was that? Kentucky, originally, before the war. He glanced up at that. You moved west after. Thomas wanted land. She shifted the lantern slightly. He had read things. Pamphlets. He believed them. A lot of men did. I know. She paused. I don't blame him for that part. I blame him for... She stopped, because she hadn't meant to start that sentence. And now she was going to have to finish it or leave it hanging, and leaving it hanging felt worse. He wasn't careful about money, about what he promised versus what he could actually deliver. He meant well. He always meant well. Cole was quiet for a moment, his hands still working. Meaning well doesn't feed anybody. No, she said, it doesn't. They stayed in the barn for another half hour after that, not talking much, just the two of them in the lantern light with the injured horse. And it was the most comfortable Evelyn had felt since arriving. Not because anything had been resolved, but because she had said something true to another person, and the world had not ended because of it. She walked back to the cabin in the cold and stood outside the door for a moment, looking up at the sky. The stars out here were different from the stars over any town she had lived in. Closer, denser, the whole enormous spread of them without anything to compete with. She had not looked at the stars since Thomas died. She had been too busy surviving to look up. She looked now for a while, long enough for the cold to start working through her coat, and then she went inside. March came in with a thaw that was not fully a thaw. The days above freezing, the nights still hard, the ground going from iron to mud to iron again in the space of 24 hours, which was harder on the infrastructure of the ranch than the straightforward cold had been. Fence posts that had heaved in the freeze needed resetting. The roof of the smaller outbuilding had developed a leak where a seam had shifted. The mud was everywhere and tracked itself into the cabin on every pair of boots that came through the door, which was a constant losing battle. Evelyn fought it grimly and without complaint, and Cole noticed. She could tell he noticed because he started leaving his boots at the door without being asked, which was not a small thing for a man who had lived alone for 7 years and answered to no one. One evening at dinner, a stew she was genuinely proud of, with the last of the dried venison and some preserved vegetables she had found in the cold room, Cole looked up from his bowl and said, without particular preamble, "You're not what I expected." She looked at him. "What did you expect?" He seemed to consider it seriously, which she appreciated. He was not a man who said things he didn't mean. Someone more, he searched for the word. "Broken," he said finally, "after everything." "I'm not broken," she said. "I know, but you're still going." She thought about that. "I don't have a choice about still going. Most people use that as an excuse to stop," he said, and went back to his stew. She sat with that for a while. Outside, the wind was up, coming off the high ridge, making the cabin walls flex slightly in that way she had stopped finding alarming and now found almost reassuring. The structure complaining but holding, the way most things worth keeping did. Noah was in his makeshift crib in the corner of the back room, sleeping in the deep, uncomplicated way of babies who have eaten recently and are warm and do not know enough yet to worry about the wind. She could hear him from where she sat. She thought about what Cole had said, and about what she had said back, and about how it was not entirely true. She did have a choice. People had choices. She had sat in that chair the night before she was led to the platform in Blackstone Crossing and thought through her options, and most of them had been terrible, but they had existed. What she had chosen, in the end, was not to stop. She was not sure when she had made that choice exactly. Maybe when she was 12 and her mother got sick and someone had to hold things together. Maybe always. Maybe it was just the shape of her, the particular way she was built, not strength exactly, but a stubborn unwillingness to lie down. Cole cleared his bowl and stood up and said, "Good stew," and took his dishes to the wash basin, and that was all. But it sat with her, what he'd said, still going, like he had noticed that specifically, like it was something worth noticing. She washed the dishes and thought about Thomas, who had loved her but not noticed her. Not really. Not the underneath of her, not the part that kept going. He had noticed her face and her figure and the way she ran a house, which were not the worst things to be noticed for, but they were not the same. She went to bed that night and lay in the dark and listened to Noah breathing and thought that she had come to this place because there was no other choice, and that she was still here because there was no other choice, and that somewhere in the middle of those two true things was something else that was also becoming true, quietly and without asking her permission. She did not let herself name it. It was too early for names, and she was too careful for that, and there was too much that could still go wrong. But it was there. She went to sleep, and for the first time since Thomas died, she did not dream about the debt. Spring came to the Cutter Range the way it always did at elevation, reluctantly in fits and starts, with false warmth followed by hard freezes that killed the early shoots, and frustrated every living thing that had started to believe winter was finished. The creek thawed and refroze twice in the first week of March. The mud that had plagued them through the thaw hardened back to iron overnight and then softened again by noon, so that every morning Cole had to reassess what work was possible and what would have to wait. Evelyn had started to read the weather by then. Not the way Cole read it. He had a rancher's accumulated instinct for what the sky meant, reading cloud formations and wind direction and the behavior of the horses with a fluency that came from years of necessity. But she had learned enough to know when the light had a certain quality in the afternoon that meant the temperature was going to drop hard by midnight, and when the wind shifted from the northwest with a particular smell in it that meant precipitation within 12 hours. She had learned it because she had to, because the ranch's needs did not pause for her education, and because Cole would sometimes say things like, "It'll snow by morning," and be right. And she had started paying attention to what preceded those predictions. Noah was 7 months old in March and had recently discovered that he possessed both volume and mobility, neither of which he was inclined to use moderately. He had learned to pull himself upright against the legs of furniture and stood trembling with effort and indignation when the furniture did not cooperate, and he screamed with a frequency and conviction that the cabin walls did nothing to muffle. Cole, who had spent 7 years in near silence, absorbed this development with an equanimity that Evelyn found either admirable or slightly incomprehensible. "He's loud," she said one evening, over Noah's ongoing monologue from the crib. "He's practicing," Cole said, not looking up from the boot he was resoling. "Practicing what?" "Being a person." He smoothed the leather with his thumb. "It takes work." She looked at him. There were moments like this, small, unremarkable moments, when Cole said something so plainly perceptive that it caught her off guard, and she would look at him and he would not look back, just continue whatever he was doing, and she would be left holding the thing he had said and not knowing quite what to do with it. She was no longer waiting for the angle. She had stopped, somewhere around the middle of February, though she had not noticed the stopping until it had already happened. What she was doing instead was more frightening in its own way, which was beginning to depend on the shape of his presence in the cabin, the way you depended on a wall you leaned against without thinking about it, not dramatically, not with any declaration, just the quiet structural fact of it. She had not said anything about this to anyone, including herself, in so many words. The morning Cole left for the eastern fence line, it was the last week of March, and the sky had the flat, pewter quality that usually meant overcast without precipitation. The kind of March sky that was not threatening but was not reassuring either. He had been meaning to get out to that section of fence for 2 weeks. It ran along the property's highest accessible boundary, where the timber thinned and the ground was exposed to the full force of whatever came off the high ridge. And winter always had its way with that stretch of wire and post. He left after breakfast with 2 horses, riding one, packing tools and supplies on the other, and told her he expected to be back by nightfall, possibly later if the damage was worse than he anticipated. "If it gets dark and I'm not back, don't worry," he said, checking the girth on the pack horse. "How far is the eastern fence?" "About 4 miles, following the upper creek." He looked at her. "It's a full day's work if the posts have heaved. Could push into evening." "And if the weather changes?" He looked at the sky. She had come to know what that meant. He was doing the same reading she did now, but faster, and with a better reference library. "Shouldn't," he said, which was not the same as won't. She stood in the yard and watched him go, the 2 horses moving easily up the track that curved north and then bent east into the timber, until the trees closed behind him and the sound of hooves faded. The morning was ordinary. She kept the stove fed and worked through the laundry and kept one eye on Noah, who was in his crib and perfectly content until he wasn't, and then she carried him on her hip while she worked, which he considered an acceptable compromise, and she considered a form of slow physical destruction. She made bread. She brought in wood. She ate at midday and watched the sky through the kitchen window. The sky had changed, not dramatically. There had been no sudden darkening, no front rolling in from the ridge. But the flat pewter quality had shifted to something heavier, lower, with a yellow-gray undertone she associated with the kind of cold that meant business. The wind was picking up from the northwest. The temperature outside, when she stepped to the porch to check, had dropped noticeably from the morning, and it was barely past noon. She went inside and stood by the stove and thought about the fact that Cole was 4 miles away on the exposed eastern boundary in weather that was developing in tensions. She put another log in the stove and told herself he was not her concern in that way. He was an adult man who had survived 7 winters in these mountains. He had looked at the sky this morning and made a judgment call, and it was his judgment call to make. She got through the afternoon by keeping busy, which was not difficult because the ranch provided endless opportunity for that. She checked the horses in the barn, Cole's remaining saddle horse and the old gray she had ridden up from Blackstone Crossing, which had become something like hers by default. She mended a tear in Noah's blanket. She started a pot of soup because there would need to be food when Cole came back. By 3 in the afternoon, the snow had started, light at first, just a scatter of flakes that might have been nothing, just spume blowing off the high ridge. But it thickened steadily, and the wind behind it had teeth. And by 4 o'clock there was an inch of new snow on the woodpile, and the temperature had dropped to a place that made January seem conversational. Cole was not back. Evelyn fed Noah and put him in the crib and stood at the window watching the snow come down in the failing afternoon light and worked through the reasonable explanations. He was sheltering in the timber. He had found worse damage than expected and was still working. He had decided to wait the snow out before heading back. He was fine. He was a man who knew these mountains. The light failed. She lit the lanterns. She fed the stove until it was running hot, because whatever happened, the cabin needed to be warm. She checked on the horses in the barn, taking the lantern with her, and stood for a moment in the barn's relative shelter and listened to the wind and looked out at the dark and the snow coming down in the lantern's small radius of light. The reasonable explanations were still there. They were still reasonable. But something cold and distinct had settled in her stomach, separate from the weather, and she was experienced enough with her own body to know that it was not imagination. She went back to the cabin and stood in the middle of the kitchen and looked at Noah asleep in the crib, and then she looked at the window, and then she looked at the barn through the window where the gray horse was. She had told herself a lot of things over the past several months about what this situation was and what it wasn't, about how she did not depend on Cole, about how she was building toward her own feet, her own standing, her own capacity to manage without needing someone else's walls around her. All of those things were true. And also, she knew where Cole Mercer was, approximately, and she knew the eastern boundary was high and exposed and the snow was coming down hard and had been for 4 hours, and she knew, with a conviction that was not panic but was not calm, either, that she was not going to sit in this cabin and wait. She bundled Noah, extra layers, the heavy wool, his face barely visible, and strapped him to her chest with the length of cloth she had rigged for carrying him in the early weeks, when the crib had been too cold. He woke up for the process and looked at her with the solemn attention of a baby, registering that something unusual was happening, and did not cry. "We're going to go find him," she told Noah, which was a ridiculous thing to say to a 7-month-old, but she needed to say it to something. She put on every layer she had, 2 dresses, the heavy coat, the extra pair of stockings, her gloves, the wool scarf wrapped twice around her face, and took the lantern and went to the barn. The gray was not happy about being saddled in the cold and dark, and said so through a series of aggrieved expressions and a refusal to stand still that cost Evelyn several minutes she did not have. She finally got the cinch tight and led the mare out into the yard, where the snow was coming down at an angle now, driven by the northwest wind, hitting her face like small thrown stones. She mounted from the fence rail. Cole had made her practice this back in February, when the barn needed work and the mounting block was inside it, and got herself and Noah seated, and picked up the reins and sat there for a moment in the dark and the wind and the snow. She knew the track north. She knew it bent east after the first timber stand following the creek. She knew she would not be able to see much beyond the lantern's reach. She knew that if she got disoriented in the timber, she could easily miss the track entirely, and then she and Noah would be lost in the mountains in a snowstorm, which was a significantly worse situation than the one she was trying to address. She also knew she was going. The gray moved out willingly enough once they were pointed up the track. Horses preferred having a direction to standing in weather, in her experience. She held the lantern out to the right so its light fell forward along the track and kept the mare at a walk, which was all the speed that was responsible in the dark on unfamiliar ground. The snow had covered most of the track's definition, but the gap in the trees marked it clearly enough, and the creak sound, such audible even under the wind, kept her bearing. The timber closed over her. The wind dropped slightly, which was the only mercy the forest offered, though the snow still came through the canopy. The lantern threw a circle of yellow light that moved with them and showed about 20 feet of track ahead and very little else, and beyond that circle there was only dark and the sound of her own horse and the wind and Noah breathing steadily inside his bundled wrappings against her chest. She talked to herself quietly, not quite out loud, more a continuous internal monologue that had found its way partially into sound, about the track, about the bearing, about the creek, which she could still hear to her left, which meant she was still running east, about how far 4 miles was on foot versus horseback in the dark, how long it might take. She was cold, not dangerously, not yet, but the kind of cold that colonizes from the outside in, settling first in the hands and feet, her feet in particular, even with the extra stockings, even with the stirrups offering some insulation, and then working inward. She curled her toes inside her boots periodically and felt the diminishing return of that effort as the temperature made itself known. Noah slept. The extraordinary thing, she would think later, was that he slept through most of it, through the wind and the horse motion and the cold, and his mother navigating a mountain track in a March snowstorm by lantern light, and slept with the absolute confidence of someone who had decided that the person carrying him had the situation handled. That confidence, irrational and complete, was either the greatest gift or the heaviest responsibility she had ever been given. Probably both. She had been riding for what felt like a long time, probably 40 minutes, maybe more, when the lantern light caught something off the track. A darker shape against the snow. She pulled the gray up and held the lantern out and looked. One of the pack horse's saddlebags lying in the snow at the track's edge. She got down from the gray carefully, keeping one hand on the saddle and one arm around Noah, and looked at the bag. It had not fallen. It had been set down deliberately, or had come loose from a horse moving in a hurry. There was a line of tracks in the snow leading off the main track, up the slope to the left, into the timber. She stood in the snow and the wind and the dark and made a decision. She followed the tracks. The slope was not steep, not right away, but it was uneven, and the snow had smoothed out the ground's true character so that she was not always sure what she was stepping on, and leading the gray uphill in the dark with a baby strapped to her chest was the kind of thing she would not, under any other circumstances, have considered attempting. She concentrated on the footprints in the snow, 2 sets, horse and human, both heading uphill, and kept moving. She almost missed him. He was 20 feet off the main direction of the tracks, in a hollow where a large pine had fallen and created a low windbreak. The pack horse was tied to a standing tree nearby, unhappy but intact. Cole was on the ground on the uphill side of the fallen trunk, partially sheltered by it, with his coat pulled tight and his hat gone. She saw it a few feet away, half buried in snow. And he was not unconscious, but he was not moving quickly either, and when the lantern light hit him, he turned his face toward it with the slow, effortful attention of someone working against more than just cold. Cole? She was moving toward him before she finished saying it. He looked at her. His face was very pale, and there was dried blood along the right side of his head, above the ear, and his right leg was extended in a way that looked deliberate, the way you held a leg that was not entirely reliable. Evelyn. He said her name with a flatness that was not indifference but effort. What in... How did you... Can you stand? I need a minute. We don't have a minute. It's getting worse. She crouched in front of him, scanning him the way she had learned to scan Noah when she didn't know what was wrong. Fast, systematic. The head wound had stopped bleeding. The leg, she couldn't tell. What happened to your leg? Horse slipped on ice on the slope, came down on me. He shifted, winced. Not broken. I don't think. Knee's not right. All right. She stood up and looked at the two horses and did the math. Can you get up if I help you? He looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between stubborn and something else, something she didn't have words for right then. You came out here in this. Yes. Can you stand or not? He could stand with help. Getting him up was not graceful. He was significantly larger than her, and the bad knee buckled twice, and she ended up with her shoulder under his arm and most of his weight on her for a moment that felt long even though it wasn't. And Noah woke up and expressed an opinion about the sudden compression from two sides, and the gray horse shifted and she had to plant her feet and hold everything together through sheer stubbornness. She got him to the gray. Getting him into the saddle with a bad knee was a separate project that required the fallen pine use a mounting aid and a level of logistical creativity that she did not fully remember afterward. But they managed it. She put him on the gray and kept the pack horse's lead rope in her hand, and she walked. She walked the 4 miles back down the track in the snow and the dark, leading both horses, carrying Noah, because Cole could ride, but she was not going to put him on a horse and walk separately where she couldn't see him, and the gray could carry his weight, but not 2 people plus a baby, and so she walked. It was the longest she had ever been cold. Not the worst cold. She had a sense of her own limits now, and she was inside them, barely, but the most sustained. The track seemed longer going back than it had coming up. She talked to keep herself awake and moving, to Noah, to the horses, to the dark, and the wind. Beside her, Cole was upright in the saddle, but not steady. And once when she looked up at him, his eyes were half closed, and she snapped his name sharply, and he opened them fully and looked at her and said, "I'm here." And she said, "Stay here." And he said, "I'm trying." And she believed him. The cabin lights were visible for a long time before she reached them. She had left every lantern burning, had left the barn door cracked with a light inside, and the combined glow was a fixed point through the trees that she had been steering toward for the last hour. When the yard finally opened up around them, she stopped walking for a moment and just stood there in the snow with her hand on the gray's neck and breathed. Getting Cole off the horse was easier than getting him on it had been. He had more capacity by then. The cold had not beaten him down further, and the steady effort of staying upright seemed to have helped him stay present. He got his good leg down, leaned on the horse, and then on Evelyn's shoulder, and they went toward the cabin in a gait that was not walking and not quite assisted walking, but something in between. She got him inside and into the chair closest to the stove. She went back out for the horses, made herself do it, because they had to be unsaddled and stabled, and she was the only person who could do it, and led them to the barn and stripped them down with hands that had stopped cooperating fully, and pushed them into their stalls and got the barn door secured and went back to the cabin. Cole had not moved from the chair. He was leaning with his elbows on his knees and his head down, and when she came in he lifted his head and looked at her, and she saw something shift in his face that was not quite any single emotion she could name. She went to the stove and put water on, and then she went to Noah, who had gone back to sleep somewhere in the last 20 minutes of the return journey and who was warm against her chest, impossibly, stubbornly warm. She unstrapped him carefully and laid him in the crib and stood over him for a moment, watching him breathe. Then she went to Cole and looked at his head. The wound was shallow. Scalp wounds bled dramatically and healed stubbornly, and this one had closed on its own, which was good, but the area around it was swollen, and she cleaned it carefully with water and clean cloth, and he sat still for it with his jaw set. His knee, when she looked at it, was swollen at the joint and hot to the touch, and he didn't hide the sharp intake of breath when she pressed it. "You need to keep off this," she said. "I've got fence that needs... The fence will be there in a week. You might not be if you tear something that's only sprained." She sat back on her heels and looked at him. "Cole, the fence can wait." He looked at her for a long moment. In the stove's light, his face was all shadow and angles, and the scar along his jaw caught the light the way it always did, and he looked... She noticed this fully for the first time, registered it as a fact about him, rather than an observation about her own perception. Like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and was wondering what it would feel like to put it down. "You walked 4 miles in that," he said. It was not exactly a question. "You would have frozen." "Maybe." He looked at his hands. "Maybe not. I'd found some shelter." "Not enough shelter." "No," he said quietly. Not enough. She stood up and went to make the coffee she had been meaning to make since she got back. She needed something to do with her hands, needed the ritual of it, the grounds, the pot, the stove. Behind her, she heard him shift in the chair. Evelyn? Why did you come? She stopped with her hand on the coffee tin. The question sat in the air between them, and it was not a question about the practical decision-making she had done this evening, the weighing of options and weather and risk. He knew that part. He was asking about the reason underneath the reason. She stood there for a moment and considered lying, or not lying exactly, but deflecting, giving him a version of the answer that was true but incomplete. The way she had learned to manage information about herself over many years of not trusting people enough to give them the complete version. She didn't do it. Because I was afraid, she said. She turned around. He was watching her from the chair with that full, quiet attention. Not of being alone. I'm used to that. She set the coffee tin down. I was afraid of not knowing, not doing something when there was something to do. He was quiet. I have spent the last 4 months, she said, being very careful about what I let myself feel about this situation. About you. She stopped. This was further than she had intended to go, but she was cold and tired and had walked 4 miles in a March snowstorm, and something in her had run out of patience with her own carefulness. And I walked out into that tonight without thinking about any of that. I just went, because the alternative was unthinkable to me. And I think you should know that. Cole looked at her for a long time. The stove ticked. Noah breathed in the crib. Outside, the wind was still going, still throwing snow at the windows, but it was outside and they were not. Evelyn, he said, and his voice had a different quality than she had heard in it before. Not softer exactly, but less armored. I have spent those same 4 months trying to figure out how to not make this harder for you than it already is. How to give you space to decide what you wanted without me putting anything on you that you didn't ask for. I noticed, she said. And? He looked at her steadily. And it was the right thing to do, she said. And also, she breathed out. Also, I wish sometimes that you were less careful, because it made it harder for me to figure out what you actually felt. He made the sound that was his nearest equivalent to a laugh, short and quiet. I felt plenty, he said. I just didn't think I had any right to it. She looked at him. He looked back at her, and there it was. Everything she had not been able to identify and had stopped trying to identify because the naming of it seemed too consequential, too much weight to put on something fragile. It was not fragile. She could see that now, looking at it directly. It was the opposite of fragile. It had been there a long time, in him, and it was built out of the same material as everything else he built. Solid, careful, intended to last. Cole, she said. I know, he said, like he had been holding the same thing she had been holding and was as tired of the weight of it as she was. She crossed the room. She sat in the other chair close enough that their knees almost touched, and she looked at him and he looked at her, and she reached out and took his damaged right hand in both of hers. Not because she had planned to, but because it was there, and because something in her needed the reality of contact, needed to confirm that he was alive and warm and in this room with her. His hand was rough and cold and closed around hers with a careful pressure that was not tentative. I don't know how to do this, she said. She meant it honestly, not as self-deprecation, but as a genuine statement of position. I did it before and I wasn't good at it. I've never done it, he said, so we'd be starting from the same place. That's not reassuring. No, he said, but it's true. Outside, the snow went on. At some point, it would stop, the way storms always did, and tomorrow the ranch would need its fence and its horses and all the ordinary, unglamorous work of survival, and they would be 2 imperfect people who had said true things to each other in the middle of the night and now had to live inside those truths. She was aware of that. She was choosing it anyway. She held his hand and they sat by the stove in the warmth and the quiet, while the storm worked itself out against the windows, and Noah slept in the crib with the invincible confidence of someone who had already decided that wherever his mother was where things would be all right. He was not wrong. For the first time in as long as she could remember, longer than the months at the ranch, longer than Thomas's death, maybe back to before she could clearly locate, Evelyn Hart was not braced for the fall. She was just sitting in a warm room, holding a man's hand, in the middle of a storm that was already beginning, somewhere in its own unreachable heart, to end. The knee kept Cole off his feet for 10 days, which was, in his estimation, 9.5 days longer than necessary, and in Evelyn's estimation, approximately the right amount of time. They argued about this, not viciously, not even particularly loudly, but with the specific friction of two people who had recently said true things to each other and were now navigating the fact that saying true things did not automatically make two people easy to live with. On the third day, she came in from the barn to find him standing at the kitchen table on the bad leg, trying to reach something on the upper shelf. "Cole? I'm fine. You said that in the snow too, and you were on the ground." He looked at her over his shoulder with an expression that was somewhere between sheepish and irritated. "It's a shelf. Sit down and tell me what you need." He sat down, because the leg was not actually fine, and they both knew it, and told her he needed the oil tin on the upper shelf, and she got it. And that was the end of that particular exchange, except that it wasn't entirely, because it sat between them for the rest of the afternoon. Not unpleasantly, just present, the texture of two people learning where the edges were. She had not had that before. Thomas's edges had been invisible until you hit them. Cole's edges were visible, but not hostile. She could see them and work around them or not, and the choice was hers, and he extended her the same courtesy. It was a different thing. She was still learning the shape of it. The storm had dropped 2 feet of snow on the upper range, which complicated everything. The eastern fence remained unfinished. Cole had repaired 2 of the 3 damaged sections before the horse went down on the ice, and the third would have to wait for conditions that allowed safe travel. The barn roof had collected enough snow to require clearing before the weight became structural, which Evelyn did herself on day 4 of Cole's enforced rest, climbing up with a wooden scoop and moving snow in the cold while he stood in the barn doorway below, watching with an expression that suggested he had strong opinions about the situation and was choosing not to voice them. She appreciated that, more than she might have expected. "You're going to tell me I'm doing it wrong," she said from the roof. "No." A pause. "You're doing it fine. Start from the peak and work down. You'll move more with each pass." She had already been doing that. She did not mention this. Noah, who had spent the storm days in the crib or strapped to Evelyn's chest and was reaching an age where confinement was a genuine philosophical grievance, had opinions about the indoor life that he communicated clearly and at volume. Cole, whose leg kept him in the cabin more than he was used to, developed an unexpected method for managing these opinions that Evelyn discovered on the 5th day when she came in from splitting wood to find Cole on the floor near the stove with Noah between his knees, showing the baby how a harness buckle worked. Noah was holding the buckle with both hands and the concentrated fury of an engineer, and Cole was talking him through the mechanism in a low, patient voice, and neither of them looked up when she came in. She stood in the doorway for a moment, snow on her coat, and felt something shift in her chest that she did not try to identify or catalog. She just let it be there. "He likes the hardware," Cole said, still not looking up. "He likes anything he can put in his mouth." "I'm not letting him put it in his mouth." "I know." She took off her coat. "I'm just telling you the motivation." By the end of the 10 days, Cole's knee had recovered enough for limited work, and the ranch had a backlog of tasks that required his specific attention. And they both understood without discussion that the period of forced proximity was transitioning into something else. Not distance, but a different shape. The shape of 2 people working alongside each other by choice rather than by weather. It was different from before the storm. Not dramatic. Nothing about Cole was dramatic, and Evelyn had her own discomfort with sentiment expressed out loud. But different in the way that the light in a room changes when you open a window you'd forgotten was there. The same space. More air. He touched her hand sometimes, passing in the narrow kitchen. Not constantly. Not in a way that demanded response, just the brief acknowledgement of contact. A thing he had not done before the night of the storm, and now did without appearing to think about it. She did not pull away. She did not make anything of it. She let it be what it was, which was someone learning the simple geography of another person's presence. The first trip to Blackstone Crossing after the storm came at the end of March. When the track had cleared enough for a wagon, Cole needed supplies, and the list was long enough to justify the wagon rather than the saddle. He asked if she wanted to come. She thought about it honestly, which meant thinking about the platform outside Crane's general store and the faces of the men in that street and Aldous Crane's expression when Cole had laid money on the edge of the dock. She thought about what it would mean to walk into that town beside Cole Mercer and what the town would make of it and what she would do with whatever they made of it. "Yes," she said. "I'll come." The ride down took most of the morning. Noah was on her lap, bundled to the eyes, watching the passing timber with the serious attention he brought to new visual information. Cole drove with the unhurried competence he brought to everything, and they talked in a way that was comfortable, not constantly, not filling silence for the sake of filling it, but the easy back and forth of people who had run out of need to perform. The town appeared below them as the track descended from the timber into the lower slopes, and Evelyn straightened slightly without meaning to. Cole glanced at her. "You all right?" "Yes." She kept her eyes on the town. "I'm fine. You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She looked at him. "I want to." He nodded and said nothing else, and that was exactly the right response. They came into Blackstone Crossing on the main street, which was where you came in if you were coming from the north, and it was the same street with the same platform outside Crane's store. And Evelyn looked at it when they passed it and felt the cold thing in her stomach that she had expected to feel and breathed through it, and it did not get bigger. Cole pulled up at the hitching post in front of the general store and climbed down and tied the team, and came around to help her down from the wagon seat. He did it the way he did everything, without ceremony, just a hand extended, steady. She took it and stepped down with Noah on her hip. The people who saw them noticed. She was aware of the noticing. The slight pause in conversation, the heads turning, the eyes doing their frontier arithmetic. A widow who had been claimed off a debt auction and a solitary rancher who had intervened coming into town together in the same wagon, the woman with a baby on her hip and her chin level and no apology on her face. She knew what they were calculating. She had calculated it herself. She did not look at the platform. She had looked at it once, and that was enough. The general store was run by a man named Garrett, who was not Crane. Crane owned the building, but Garrett managed it. And Garrett was a nervous, decent man who treated customers with the reflexive courtesy of someone who had learned that being unpleasant was bad for business. He greeted Cole and then looked at Evelyn, and after a moment's visible recalibration said, "Mrs. Hart, good to see you." "Mr. Garrett," she said, and went to look at the dry goods. She was examining bolts of fabric. Noah needed new clothes at a rate that was frankly offensive given how little he was doing with them. When she heard the bell above the door and felt, before she turned around, a change in the room's quality. The kind of change a room made when someone walked in who commanded that kind of response. Aldous Crane was not a tall man, but he had the bearing of someone who had never needed height to occupy a room. He came in his vest and his watch chain and looked around the store with the proprietorial ease of a man surveying his own property, which was not inaccurate. His gaze found Cole first, a nod, measured, acknowledging, and then found Evelyn, and stayed there for a moment longer than was comfortable. "Mrs. Hart," he said, the same tone as Garrett, but with a different freight inside it. "Mr. Crane," she said. He looked at Noah, then back at her. "Settling in well, I take it." "Very well, thank you." Cole had moved from the tools section to a position that was not between them, exactly, but was closer than he had been, and Crane would have had to be obtuse not to read that, and whatever else Crane was, he was not obtuse. He looked at Cole with the expression of a man revising a calculation. "Mercer," he said, "I trust you received my letter." "I did," Cole said. He had not mentioned a letter to Evelyn. She filed that for later. "I'll have the survey response to you by end of April." "See that you do." Crane's eyes moved back to Evelyn one more time, a look that was not threatening but was appraising, the look of a man deciding what something was worth. Then he went to speak to Garrett, and the room relaxed by approximately 10 degrees. Evelyn kept her face neutral and went back to the fabric. When they were loading the wagon, she said, "What letter?" Cole handed up a sack of grain. "Crane's been making noise about a survey dispute, the eastern boundary of my property. He claims his title documentation puts his grazing rights up to the ridge line." "And does it?" "No, I've got the original homestead filing." He handed up another sack. "He knows that. He's not going to win it. But he can make noise while he tries, which costs me time." "Does he know about—" She stopped, because there was no clean way to finish that sentence. About what exactly? About the fact that she was living at the ranch. About the fact that things had changed since the storm. About the fact that she was not, any longer, simply a woman sheltering there until she found her feet. Cole looked up at her. "He knows you're at the ranch," he said. "Everyone knows that. Whether they know what it means is another question, and it's not one they're owed an answer to." She thought about that. "He's going to use it," she said, "whatever he thinks it is. He'll use it somehow." "Probably," Cole said, without particular alarm. "Let him try." He said it with such flat certainty that she almost believed it was that simple. She did not fully believe it. She knew enough about men like Crane to know that their trying was rarely without consequence, but she appreciated the certainty, the way it functioned as ballast. The drive back up to the ranch was quieter than the drive down. The sun was already moving west by the time they cleared the lower slopes, and the light on the snow had that late afternoon quality that made everything look briefly like a painting before it faded. Noah had fallen asleep against her shoulder. She was thinking about Crane's eyes, about the survey dispute, about the way certain men treated an absence of leverage as a temporary condition to be remedied. "He's not going to let it go," she said. "No," Cole agreed. "The survey dispute is an opening. If he can cloud your title, even temporarily, he can cause enough uncertainty to—" She stopped herself. "I'm sorry. It's not my problem to solve." "It's your problem too," Cole said, and the plainness of it struck her more than he probably intended. Not a claim, just a fact, stated as a fact, in the way he stated things. She looked at the mountain track ahead. "I was going to say, it might help to have someone go through your original filing, the homestead documentation. I can read a legal document. I worked as a clerk for a land attorney for a year before Thomas and I came west." She had not told him this before. "I know what to look for." He glanced at her. "You didn't mention that." "It hasn't come up until now." She shifted Noah carefully. "Let me look at what you have. If Crane's pushing a survey dispute, the original language matters. What the filing says about the boundary markers." "All right," he said, and she could hear in it that this was not reluctant agreement but genuine relief, the kind a person felt when a problem they've been carrying alone became suddenly a problem they could hand to someone competent. She spent the first 3 days of April at the table with Cole's land documentation spread out in front of her, going through the original homestead filing and the survey notes from 1871, when the property had been formally registered. Noah played on a blanket on the floor beside her, increasingly mobile and increasingly determined to eat the documents, which she managed by giving him a wooden spoon and hoping for the best. Cole came in from outside periodically, checked on the progress without hovering, and brought her coffee without being asked, which she acknowledged without looking up. The filing was solid. The boundary descriptions were specific and tied to permanent markers. The creek fork, a particular rock formation on the eastern ridge, a named cairn that would still be there. Crane's claim, as Cole described it from the letter, rested on a reinterpretation of the phrase "to the ridge line" in a secondary grazing document that had nothing to do with the original title. It was not a strong claim, but it was the kind of thing that could be made expensive and slow if Crane chose to pursue it. "He could tie this up in territorial court for a year," she said on the third evening. "Not because he'd win, because he can." Cole was at the stove stirring something. "I know. What he's after isn't the land, necessarily. He'd be happy to make the litigation expensive enough that you have to sell at a loss." "I know that too." She looked up from the papers. "You need a statement from someone who can attest to the original survey markers, someone who was there or someone who can document the markers as they currently stand. If you can file a counterstatement with the territorial recorder before Crane gets his formal claim submitted, you preempt him." Cole set the spoon down and turned around and looked at her. "You said you worked for a land attorney." "For a year, yes. I was not an attorney, but I know how these filings work." "Could you draft the counterstatement?" She had thought about this. "I could draft the language. You'd need a licensed man to submit it, but the substance of it, yes." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she recognized now, the careful, full attention look that meant he was taking something seriously, not performing the taking seriously, but actually doing it. "All right," he said, "do it." She drafted the counterstatement over the following week, working in the evenings after Noah was down, with Cole sitting nearby doing the small repair work that accumulated over a winter, mending tack, sharpening tools, the endless small maintenance of a working ranch. They talked while they worked, sometimes about the legal language, sometimes about other things. About the ranch's history, which Cole had learned piecemeal from the man he'd bought it from, an older homesteader named Pruitt, who had given up on the altitude after his wife died. About the Cutter Range itself, the geography of it, the way it changed with the seasons. About Noah, who had that week pulled himself fully upright against the leg of the table and stood there for approximately 4 seconds before sitting down hard on the floor and looking at the ceiling with an expression of profound reassessment. "He's going to walk early," Cole said, watching this. "He's going to walk, and I'm going to have no peace at all," Evelyn said. "We," Cole said. He had been saying that more lately. "We, not you." She had noticed. She handed the draft counterstatement to Cole in the second week of April with 6 pages of notes on the filing references and the specific counter-arguments. He read it that evening, slowly, the way he read everything, with complete attention and no performative speed. When he was done, he set it on the table and looked at it for a moment. "This is good," he said. "This is better than good. It's solid. Whether it's enough depends on who Crane knows on the bench." "Most men on the bench know me too," he said, which was not arrogance. It was the plain statement of a man who had been in the territory for 7 years and had been honest in his dealings and had the accumulated credibility of that. He took the counterstatement to the territorial recorder's office in the first week of May, before Crane had filed anything formal. When he came back, he reported that the recorder had accepted it and entered it into the file, and that was that for the moment. Crane would either back down or pursue it, and if he pursued it, they would deal with it then. Evelyn realized, receiving this report, that she had stopped distinguishing in her own mind between Cole's problems and hers. Not because she had been taken over by his concerns, but because the ranch, the place, the land, the accumulated daily work of it, had become something she had invested herself in, genuinely, in a way that was not about debt or obligation, but about care. She had come here with nothing and had spent months putting herself into the fabric of this place, and you could not do that, she was finding, without the place becoming partly yours. That was a new thought. She stayed with it. The community's opinion on their arrangement, for there was a community opinion, as there was on all things in frontier settlements, a collective running assessment of everyone's business, had evolved over the months. At first it had been the uncomplicated judgment of gossip, a widow woman living on a bachelor rancher's property, circumstances obvious, conclusion drawn with the efficiency of people who had limited entertainment and an appetite for narrative. The women in town who had smiled at Evelyn at church socials before Thomas died smiled at her differently now, which was to say, some of them did not smile at all, and others smiled with a particular quality of sympathy that was really a form of condescension, and a few smiled the same as they always had, which was the subset she was grateful for. She had gone back to Blackstone Crossing 3 more times by May, twice with Cole, once alone to collect a package that had been held at the post office. Letters she had written before winter, requests for information about land records and legal precedents, answers she had been waiting on. Each time she walked through that town, she felt the assessment happening, felt the looks and the half-conversations that stopped when she came near. And each time she held herself at the same angle, not defiant, not apologetic, just present. She was there. She was not going to pretend otherwise. She had a conversation in the dry goods store in early May with a woman named Margaret Finch, whose husband ran the sawmill, and who had the straightforward manner of someone who had been surviving the frontier long enough to have little patience for performance. "People are talking about you," Margaret said, not unkindly, sorting through bolts of cloth beside her. "I know," Evelyn said. "Do you care?" Evelyn thought about it honestly. "I care what certain people think," she said, "the ones whose opinion is worth something. The rest—" She picked up a bolt of blue cotton and looked at it. "I used to think that other people's judgment of me was something I had to manage, that my respectability was something I carried around and was responsible for not dropping." She set the bolt down. "I'm less convinced of that now." Margaret looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Cole Mercer is a good man. People who know him know that." "I know that," Evelyn said. She had known it for a while now. She had been slow to admit knowing it, which was not the same as not knowing it. Margaret nodded like something had been confirmed and went back to her fabric. The Dobbins brothers, one of the men who had bid at the auction, made a remark in the street in mid-May that Evelyn did not hear directly, but that was reported to her by the woman at the post office with the apologetic expression of someone who felt obligated to warn her about things she might want to know. It was not a remark worth repeating. The substance of it was the kind of judgment that men like the Dobbins brothers applied to women in Evelyn's situation as a matter of reflex, and it said considerably more about them than about her. Cole heard about it too. He said nothing to her about it for 2 days, and then on the third day she noticed he had made a point of stopping at the mill to speak to Margaret Finch's husband, and that the Dobbins brothers had subsequently conducted their business elsewhere. She did not ask him about it. Some things did not need to be spoken to be understood. What she understood was that he was not embarrassed by her, that the thought of being embarrassed by her appeared not to have occurred to him. He had paid nearly $300 to stop an auction and brought her to his ranch and told the Frontier what it could do with its opinion simply by living his life and not apologizing for any part of it, and she had mistaken that for simplicity for a long time, before she understood it was actually a form of strength that was rarer than the kind that came from muscles and weapons. Noah started walking on the 18th of May. Not graceful walking, lurching, 3-step running falls, the headlong momentum of a person who has not yet learned to stop, but walking, unassisted, across the kitchen floor, headed for Cole, who was crouched at the far end with his hands out. Noah made it 4 steps before sitting down hard on the floor. He looked at Cole. Cole looked back at him. "Again," Cole said. Noah considered this directive, pulled himself up using Cole's outstretched hand, and tried again. Made it 3 steps this time, which was worse, but he did not seem discouraged. He sat down, looked up, and made a sound that was not quite a word but had the structure of one. Evelyn was standing in the kitchen doorway, watching, with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had gone cold while she wasn't paying attention. She thought about the platform in Blackstone Crossing, the cold morning and the crowd and the deputy reading numbers from a page, and herself standing up there with the same child against her chest, looking at the mountains because she couldn't look at the crowd. 4 months old then, limp with cold, his dark eyes moving over a world that meant nothing to him yet. He was meaning things to him now. He had opinions about harness buckles and wooden spoons and the barn cats, 2 of them small and gray and tolerant of baby attention beyond any reasonable expectation. He had opinions about Cole, specifically, which were evident in the way he tilted his whole body toward the man whenever he was in the room, the way he oriented to him like a compass finding north. Cole took those 4 steps again, and 4 more, this time to Evelyn, at the doorway, and grabbed her knee with both hands, and stood there looking up at her with an expression of absolute pride in his own accomplishment. "Look at you," she said, and picked him up, and he squirmed and reached back toward Cole because he was determined about things. Cole came and stood beside her, and Noah grabbed his collar and pulled, which Noah considered a greeting and Cole accepted as one, and Evelyn stood between them in the morning light in a kitchen that smelled like coffee and wood smoke and the persistent evidence of living, and thought, this. Not the word, not the shape, just the thing itself, present and solid and improbably real, built out of debt and snow and a stranger's inexplicable decency and her own stubborn refusal to stop. This was what it looked like when things didn't break you. She had not known, until now, that there was a what it looked like. She had assumed surviving was its own conclusion. She was beginning to understand it was only the beginning of something. Summer came to the Cutter Range the way good things sometimes did, quietly, without announcing itself, so that one morning you simply looked up and realized the world had changed while you were busy with other things. The snow retreated up the ridgelines. The creek ran full and loud with meltwater. The pasture grass came in thick and green, and the horses moved out into it with the particular pleasure of animals that have endured a long winter and know, in whatever way animals know things, that the worst is behind them. Evelyn noticed the change in herself the same way. Not a single moment of transformation, but an accumulation of small recognitions, each one barely registering until there were enough of them that she could not ignore the sum. She noticed it in the way she walked through the cabin in the morning, without the careful internal inventory she had kept for months, checking herself, checking the situation, checking for the thing that was going to go wrong. She noticed it in the way she said we when she talked about the ranch's needs to Cole, and the fact that she had stopped noticing when she said it. She noticed it in the way Noah moved through the space, toddling between the furniture with the proprietary confidence of someone who had decided this particular floor was his, and the way she watched him do it without the compressed fear that used to live behind everything. The crane dispute had gone quiet, which was not the same as resolved. Cole had heard through Margaret Finch's husband that Crane had consulted a territorial attorney who had apparently given him an honest assessment of the counterstatement Evelyn had drafted, because Crane had not filed anything formal by the time June came in, and the recorder's office had confirmed to Cole that the filing remained unchallenged. It might stay that way. It might not. Either way, they had done what could be done, and the rest was not in their hands. "He'll try something else eventually," Evelyn said one evening, in the way of a woman who has read enough legal documents to know that men like Crane did not run out of angles, only specific angles. "Probably," Cole said, "but not this." "That's not exactly reassuring." "No," he said, "it's just true." She had learned to accept that from him, the plain truth without the comfort added to make it easier to swallow. She had thought, when she first arrived, that his flatness about difficult things was a kind of coldness, a man who had been alone too long to remember how to soften things for other people. She understood now that it was the opposite. He respected her enough not to soften things. There was more dignity in that than in the soft version, even when the soft version would have been easier to hear. In June, a man came up from Blackstone Crossing. He arrived on a weekday morning when Cole was out checking the upper pasture fence, the eastern section finally repaired after the March storm damage, and Evelyn was in the yard with Noah, who was conducting an investigation of the barn cat's patience that would have concerned a less tolerant animal. The rider came up this north track in the mid-morning, and she watched him come with the habitual assessment she had developed over the winter, reading the approach of a stranger the way Cole read weather. He was not young, perhaps 50, wearing a decent coat, riding a horse that was better than average. He carried himself with the careful posture of a man who took his own position seriously. When he pulled up at the yard's edge and removed his hat, she saw a face that was professionally pleasant in a way she associated with men who spent their lives either negotiating or deciding, and she put him as the second type before he opened his mouth. "Mrs. Hart?" he said. "Who's asking?" she said, which was not a polite response and was exactly the response she felt like making. If he was put off by it, he did not show it. "My name is Garrison Price. I'm a land agent with the Territorial Development Authority. I was hoping to speak with the property owner." "He's on the property," she said. "I'll tell him you're here when he comes in." She did not invite Garrison Price inside. She offered him water for his horse, which he accepted, and let him wait in the yard while she kept one eye on him and the other on Noah, who had determined that the barn cat's ears were interesting and was pursuing this hypothesis with scientific rigor. Cole came in an hour later, saw the horse at the post and the man in the yard, and looked at Evelyn with a brief question in his eyes. She gave him the slight tilt of her head that meant, "I don't know yet, pay attention," which was a shorthand they had developed without discussing it. He listened to Garrison Price for 20 minutes. Evelyn stood near the porch with Noah on her hip and listened too, because she was not pretending to be uninvolved in the property's affairs, not anymore, and Price had the adaptability to address himself to both of them after the first 5 minutes, which she respected him for. The pitch was this: the Territorial Development Authority was working with several private investors to expand cattle operations in the Cutter Range Valley. They were making offers on several parcels in the upper range. Cole's property, its location, its water access, its established infrastructure so made it particularly interesting. The offer was better than fair. Price named a figure. It was a significant figure. More than the property had cost Cole, more than the years of work in it by the measure of dollars. The kind of number that could set a person up somewhere else, somewhere easier, somewhere without 10-foot winter snows and the perpetual work of high-altitude ranching. Cole listened to all of it without changing his expression. Then he said, "Who's behind the authority?" Price smiled the smile of a man who had been asked this before. "It's a consortium of investors from—" "Is Aldous Crane one of them?" A pause, small but present. "Mr. Crane is one of several stakeholders in—" "No," Cole said. Price tried several more angles, which were not bad angles. He was good at his job. But Cole was not a man whose position shifted under social pressure, and Evelyn had long since identified that as one of the things she relied on most about him, because it meant that what he said was what he meant, and what he meant did not change because the room wanted it to. When Price had gone, Cole stood in the yard for a moment, looking down the track where the rider had disappeared into the timber. "He'll be back," Evelyn said. "He'll send someone else back," Cole said. "Crane won't use the same face twice after a refusal." He turned. "You think the survey dispute and this are connected?" "I think Crane has been trying to acquire this parcel for at least 2 different reasons, using at least 2 different methods," she said. "The survey dispute clouds your title. If that doesn't work, an offer through a development authority is the next step. If you won't sell, there'll be a 3rd step." Cole looked at her. "What's the 3rd step?" "I don't know yet." She shifted Noah. "But I'd like to know before it happens rather than after." He nodded slowly. "All right, what do we do?" The fact that he said we and meant it entirely, not as a courtesy, not as an acknowledgement that she happened to be there, but as a genuine question directed at a genuine partner, was something she had stopped taking as remarkable, which was itself remarkable, because 6 months ago she would not have known what to do with it. "I write to the territorial recorder again," she said. "I want to see who filed the Development Authority's charter and when. If Crane's name appears in the founding documents, that's relevant to your counterstatement. It establishes a pattern of attempted acquisition." "Can you do that? Request the charter documents?" "Anyone can request public filings." She looked at him. "It'll take time. The recorder's office is not fast." "That's all right," he said. "We have time." She wrote the letters that evening, after Noah was down. Cole sat across from her at the table with his own work. He had taken to keeping the ranch's accounts more carefully since she arrived, partly because she had asked to see them, and partly, she suspected, because having someone who could read a ledger with competence had made him want the ledger to be worth reading. He was not a careless man, but he had been a solitary one, and solitary men sometimes let the documentation of their own lives go unmaintained because there was no one to maintain it for. She sealed her letters and looked up and found him looking at her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said, and looked back at the ledger. "Cole." He set the pencil down. He did something with his jaw that she had come to identify as the expression of a man working up to saying something he had been not saying for a while. She waited, because she had learned that rushing him out of that process produced abbreviated versions of things she wanted the complete version of. "I've been trying to figure out how to say something," he said. "All right. I've been trying to figure out if it's too soon to say it." He looked at the table rather than at her, which was the tell. He could hold eye contact through almost anything except the things that actually mattered to him, and with those he looked slightly away, like the direct look would cost too much. "And I can't decide if it's too soon because I don't have a basis for comparison." "You can just say it," she said. "I'm not going to—" She stopped. She had been going to say, "I'm not going to run," but that was a strange thing to say to a man who had never given her reason to think he expected her to, except that she had come here in the first place because there was nowhere else to go. And they both knew that, and maybe that history was what made him uncertain. "Just say it," she said. He reached into his breast pocket. He set something on the table between them, a ring, a plain gold band with a small dark stone that caught the lantern light and held it. Old, the metal worn smooth with years of being on someone's hand. "My mother's," he said. "She left it to me. I don't know why. I suppose she didn't have a daughter." He looked at it. "I've been carrying it in that pocket for 6 months, since February." Evelyn looked at the ring and then at him. "I know this started because you had nowhere else to go," he said. "I know you came up here because every other option was worse. And I don't want you to say yes because it's practical. I don't want it to be—" He stopped, starting over. "I want to ask you because I want a life with you. Not because it makes sense on paper. Not because it's the next logical thing. Because I would rather do this hard, unglamorous, frostbitten, fence-mending life with you in it than the other version without you." He looked up. "And I think Noah deserves a father who isn't going to leave." She sat with that for a moment. The lantern burned between them. Outside, the summer night was quiet. No wind, the creek audible at this distance only if you knew to listen for it. She had been married before. She knew what marriage looked like when it was built on the wrong things. Charm instead of character, promise instead of consistency, the performance of a future rather than the building of one. She knew the difference now between a man who said things and a man who did them, and she was looking at the second kind across a table in a cabin that she had helped make livable and sitting next to letters she had written to protect land that she had come to think of as partially her own. She also knew she was afraid. Not of him, not of this, of the particular vulnerability of wanting something and having it, which was a different and more exposed kind of fear than the fear of wanting things you couldn't have. When you had nothing to lose. She had been accumulating things she could lose for 6 months, and the accumulation of them had made her more afraid, not less. She picked up the ring, looked at it in the lantern light. "The dark stone," she said. "What is it?" "Garnet, I think. She always called it garnet." She turned it in her fingers. The stone was deep red in the warm light, the color of something old and kept and valued. "You said you've never done this," she said. "I haven't. I've done it, and I wasn't good at it." She set the ring down and looked at him. "I want you to know that going in. I am not patient when I'm tired. I have opinions about the right way to do things, and I express them at length. I held this man's hand." She nodded toward the doorway, toward the crib in the back room where Noah slept. "At your kitchen table and told you I was fine for 3 weeks, when I was nowhere close to fine, and that is the kind of dishonesty I am capable of when I'm frightened." "I know all of that," Cole said. "I'm telling you formally." "I know that too." He looked at her with that full, steady attention. "I also know you walked 4 miles in a March blizzard because you were afraid I was dying. I know you drafted a legal counterstatement that probably saved my land. I know you took Noah's fever through an entire night without sleeping and didn't say you were scared until a week later when it wasn't scary anymore." He paused. "I'm not asking for someone perfect, Evelyn. I'm asking for you." She looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said, not dramatically. Not with tears, though something was happening in her chest that was in the neighborhood of them. Just, yes, plainly, the way she said things that she meant entirely. He let out a breath that she realized he had been holding for longer than just this conversation. She picked up the ring and put it on her own finger, which was a thing she had decided to do herself rather than wait, because she was that kind of person, and he would find that out sooner or later, and there was no point pretending otherwise. It fit, approximately, close enough. "It'll need to be sized," she said. "All right," he said, and the thing that crossed his face then was not quite a smile and was better than one, and she understood that she would spend a long time learning all the specific ways this man's face worked, and would not find it boring. They were married in September in Blackstone Crossing, in the small ceremony that was available to people who were not wealthy and did not require spectacle. Margaret Finch and her husband stood as witnesses. Noah, 14 months old, and at the height of his ambulatory ambitions, was kept from reorganizing the proceedings by the barn cat, which someone had unwisely allowed into the room, and which Noah considered more interesting than any human ceremony. The judge who performed the ceremony was a decent man who did not comment on the circumstances of Evelyn's arrival in the territory, which she appreciated. Aldous Crane was not there. He had not been invited. He was, as it happened, occupied with a communication from the territorial recorder's office, because the letters Evelyn had written in June had produced results by August. The Development Authority's charter documents had arrived, and Crane's name appeared in them, and so did language about the Cutter Range properties, and the dates were instructive. The authority had been established the previous autumn, months before the survey dispute letter had been sent, which established a pattern of intent that a territorial judge would find relevant if the dispute was ever formally filed. Evelyn had sent a copy of this finding, with her analysis, to the territorial recorder and to a land rights attorney in the nearest city, with a cover letter explaining the full sequence of events. She had written it carefully, in the measured professional language of someone who had worked for a land attorney and knew which words did the most work. She had not consulted Cole before sending it, which she told him about afterward. He was quiet for a moment. "You should have told me first," he said. "You would have told me to wait and see if Crane backed off," she said. "Yes," he said. "And I didn't want to wait," she said. "I wanted to establish the record while the documentation was fresh." He looked at her with the expression she now recognized as the one that meant she had done the right thing in the wrong way, and he was working out how to say that without it becoming an argument. "Next time," he said, "tell me first." "All right," she said. "I will." It was not a smooth moment. It was a real one, the kind that came from two people with their own ways of managing problems, learning to manage problems together, and those moments had their texture, their friction. She did not wish them away. The smoothness she had had with Thomas, the surface of it, the careful pleasantness, had hidden everything underneath until the underneath was all there was. She preferred this. The friction of two actual people rubbing against each other's actual edges, learning over time where to give way and where to hold. By October, Crane had quietly withdrawn his association from the Development Authority. The authority itself continued. There were other investors and other parcels, but the Mercer property was no longer on their list of targets, and the survey dispute had not been formally filed, and the territorial recorder had a detailed record of the attempted acquisition pattern if it ever needed to be referenced. Margaret Finch told Evelyn about Crane's withdrawal with the satisfied economy of a woman who had been watching a situation resolve correctly. He knows when a thing is finished, Margaret said. I'll give him that. He'll find another angle, Evelyn said. She still believed this. Some men just kept coming at different angles, not because they needed what they were after, but because they were constitutionally unable to accept a loss. Maybe, Margaret said, but not with you two. He knows what he's dealing with now. Evelyn thought about that on the way home. She was alone. Cole had taken Noah for the afternoon, which he did more frequently now, navigating the ranch with a toddler determined to investigate everything at knee height, which Cole managed with the same patient competence he managed everything. She had the time alone to think, which she did not always use for thinking, but appreciated having. Crane knew what he was dealing with. She turned that over. What he was dealing with was a woman who had shown up in his town with nothing and had stood on his platform and looked at his mountains and chosen the only option that was not ruin, and had spent the following year building something out of that choice with her own hands and her own mind, and was not going to be displaced from what she had built by a survey letter or a development consortium or the persistent social arithmetic of men who measured women by their circumstances rather than their actions. He had miscalculated that. She did not think he would miscalculate it again. She was not triumphant about it. The thing she felt was quieter than triumph, more durable. She had not defeated Crane. She had simply refused to be defeated by him, which was a different thing and less dramatic and more honest about what survival actually looked like. It was not glorious. It was a counterstatement filed in time. It was letters to the right offices. It was two people at a table in the evening, one with a pencil and one with a ledger, doing the unglamorous work of protecting the thing they had built. The letters from the territorial attorney came in November, confirming that the record Evelyn had established was sufficient to constitute a documented pattern of attempted interference with the homestead title, and that any future action by Crane or affiliated entities could be challenged on those grounds. The attorney had added a note, handwritten, at the bottom of the formal letter. The counter-statement was well drafted. You have a good eye for the relevant language. She showed it to Cole. He read it and then looked at her. You know what this is. A legal opinion. It's also... He stopped. You didn't have to do any of this. The legal work. You could have let me handle it. I know, she said. But you did it. It needed to be done, and I knew how to do it. She set the letter on the table. That's all it is, Cole. He looked at her with the look she had stopped being able to fully interpret, which was fine. She had given up the idea that people were supposed to be fully interpretable to each other. She knew the important things about this man. She knew how he was when things were hard, which was the only knowledge that really mattered in the end. No, he said, it's not all it is. It's you. He said it simply, the way he said things that were true and did not need ornamentation. It's who you are. She looked away because she was not entirely comfortable receiving things, even now, even after a year of learning to. That was her own particular edge. She was working on it. The first snow came in November, a polite early snow that covered the pasture and the woodpile and the track to the eastern fence. And Cole shoveled the yard, and Evelyn brought in the extra wood, and Noah, bundled to near immobility, stood on the porch and pointed at the snow with the gravity of someone who had met it once before and formed an opinion. Cold, Noah said. It was not quite his first word. He had produced several before this, mostly variations on the barn cat's name, and a sound that might have been Cole's, but it was one of the first purposeful ones, directed at a specific thing, describing it accurately. Yes, Cole said from the yard. Cold. Noah pointed at Cole. Cole, he said, which was the word he had been using for him for a month now. Not day or any variation of it, just Cole. Learned from Evelyn's usage and applied with the certainty of a child who had decided that this was the correct word for this person and was not interested in alternatives. Cole looked at him. Something happened in Cole's face then that Evelyn watched from the doorway and did not have words for, which was all right because some things did not need words. It was not a complicated expression. It was a man looking at a child who had said his name as though naming him was naming something important, something that belonged in that child's world as a permanent fixture, and feeling the weight of being that to someone, and not flinching from it. He had told her, in September, that he wanted to be a father who wasn't going to leave. She had understood it as a statement of intention. She understood now that it was also a statement about what he had not had, a childhood that included someone who stayed, and that choosing to be different from what you were given was its own kind of courage, quieter than the kind that got recognized in the territory's stories about itself, but harder in its way, because it required not a single act but a lifetime of small, consistent ones. She went inside and let them have the snow together. Spring of the following year was different from the spring before. Not in the mountains. Those were the same reluctant thaw, the same mud, the same creek running loud with melt. The difference was in the ranch, which had been added to over the winter. A new section of barn, built by Cole and two men from the valley who had come up to help in exchange for fair wages, so that the horse operation could expand in the summer. The difference was in the garden, which Evelyn had started in earnest, because the previous year's attempt at a kitchen garden had been small and tentative, and this year's was neither. The difference was in Noah, who was 17 months old and had opinions about the garden and expressed them by removing planted seedlings and investigating them, which required Evelyn to develop a fencing strategy that Cole found funnier than she did. The difference was also in what people called her in town. It happened without announcement. She noticed it in the spring, 2 or 3 months after the wedding, that the adjustment had occurred. Mrs. Mercer, instead of Mrs. Hart, said without calculation or comment, just the natural update of a community's operating files. Margaret Finch had been saying it since September. Garrett at the general store had taken a month or two longer. Even the recorder's office, when the final communication about the Crane matter had arrived, had addressed it to Mrs. E. Mercer. She was not sentimental about the name. She had kept Hart for a year after Thomas died, which was convention, and she had taken Mercer because it was true, and names were true things, or they were not worth keeping. But she noticed what it signified, the shift in how the town had updated its accounting of her. From the widow woman at Cole Mercer's ranch to the woman who ran Cole Mercer's ranch, which were different classifications entirely, the second one carrying the specific kind of respect that the frontier extended to people who had demonstrated they could make something out of difficult materials. She had not sought it. She was not sure she entirely trusted it, because she knew how quickly social respect could be withdrawn by communities that granted it on conditions. But she received it without apology, the way she had learned to receive most things, directly, without pretending she didn't notice. One afternoon in May, she was in the yard when she saw a wagon coming up the north track. Not an unusual thing. The ranch had more visitors than it had in Cole's solitary years, because ranching in proximity to other people required occasional interaction, and she had pushed them gradually toward more of it. But this wagon was pulling a second vehicle behind it, a loaded one, and there was a family in the front wagon, a woman and 2 children, and a man who drove with the uncertain grip of someone who did not yet know his destination well. They had read about the valley in a pamphlet, the man said, when Cole came out from the barn. They were looking to settle. Someone in Blackstone Crossing had told them that the Mercer Ranch was the place to ask about where the good land was. Cole looked at Evelyn. She looked at the family. The woman with 2 small children on her lap, thin with travel, watching Evelyn with the particular attention of a woman in a desperate situation, assessing whether the woman in front of her has any reason to help. Evelyn knew that look. She had worn it. "Come in," she said. "There's coffee. You can tell us where you're coming from, and we'll tell you what we know about the valley." The family came in. Noah immediately identified the 2 children as persons of interest and led them toward the barn with the proprietary confidence of a host, which was either charming or alarming, depending on how well you knew him and how much you valued barn cat welfare. Cole made coffee. Evelyn sat across from the woman. Her name was Clara. Her husband was Daniel. They had come from Missouri. And listened, because she understood that sometimes the first thing a person needed was someone willing to listen. They stayed for 2 days. Cole knew of 3 parcels in the lower valley that were available for homestead filing, and he described them honestly. The good and the difficult, the water access and the winter conditions, and what the first year would actually ask of them. Evelyn wrote out the filing information for the recorder's office and explained the process in plain language. When Daniel shook Cole's hand before they left, he said, "You didn't have to do any of this. People helped us," Cole said, which was a compression of history that Evelyn appreciated for its accuracy and its restraint. She stood in the yard and watched the wagon go back down the track and thought about the morning she had come up that track in the other direction, on the gray horse in the cold, with her trunk on the saddle and $8.40 and a 4-month-old son and no clear idea of what she was walking into. She had been trying to survive. That was all. She had not had the luxury of thinking beyond survival, which was the thing that survival cost you. The inability to see past itself, the way it demanded all of your attention and used it up, so that the future was just more present tense, more getting through. At some point, without quite noticing the crossing of the line, she had moved from surviving to building. And the difference between the two was enormous and quiet and almost impossible to describe to someone who had not felt it. The difference between keeping your head above water and walking on solid ground, between managing and choosing, between existing in a situation and constructing one. She had not done it alone. She would not pretend she had. Cole had extended a hand on a freezing morning in front of a crowd that was watching to see what the math added up to, and she had taken it not because she trusted him, but because every other option was worse. And from that unpromising beginning, they had built something that was not clean or perfect or without its fractures, but was real and solid, and theirs in a way that required both of them to remain true. That was the thing no one told you about belonging, not the romantic version, not the version where you arrived somewhere and the place recognized you and welcomed you in. The real version, which was slower and less comfortable. You built belonging out of repeated daily presence, out of showing up when things were hard, out of staying in the room during the conversations that were easier to walk away from. You built it out of counterstatements filed on time and coffee kept warm and 4 miles walked in the dark. It was not granted. It was constructed the way Cole had built the barn, incrementally, with attention to what would last. Cole came to stand beside her, watching the wagon disappear into the timber. Noah was on his hip, uncharacteristically still, watching the trees with the focused attention of a child processing something. "Gone," Noah said. "Gone," Cole agreed. "They'll be back, probably, once they're settled." Noah accepted this and returned to investigating a button on Cole's coat. Cole looked at Evelyn. "You all right?" "Yes," she said. And then, because she was trying to be more honest than she had been in the early months, less reflexively fine, "I was thinking about the morning I came up here." "January," he said. "January." She looked at the track where the wagon had disappeared. "I couldn't see past the day. I couldn't think about what came after. I just thought, get through today. And now?" She looked out at the pasture, green in the May morning, and the mountains beyond it, and the line of white still on the highest ridges that would be there until July, and the barn with its new section that still smelled of fresh-cut timber, and the garden she had fenced against her son's investigations, and the kitchen where there was coffee and bread and a legal document in the drawer that protected the land they stood on. "Now I think about next year," she said, "and the year after that." Cole was quiet beside her for a moment, in the particular way that was not the absence of something but the presence of it, the quiet of a man who was exactly where he had decided to be and was not looking anywhere else. "That's a good thing to think about," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." She reached over and took Noah's small hand, which he allowed for approximately 4 seconds before reclaiming it for button-related purposes. The morning was warm and the creek was audible from where they stood, and the mountains did what mountains did, which was endure, which was the one thing the territory had always been trying to teach everybody, and which most people learned too slowly, and some never learned at all. She had learned it the hard way, which was the only way it stuck. Not that hardship made people stronger. She did not believe that, had never believed it, because she had seen hardship break people cleanly and completely and leave nothing recoverable behind. But she believed that some people, given hardship and a hand extended at the right moment and the stubbornness not to stop, found out what they were actually made of. And what she was made of, it turned out, was the kind of material that held. She had not known that about herself. On the platform in January, she had only known she would not look at the crowd. She knew it now. The morning went on around them. The ordinary, unremarkable, necessary morning of a working ranch in spring, with its demands and its small satisfactions and its persistent evidence of life being lived rather than merely endured. Cole went back to the barn. Noah followed him because Noah followed him everywhere, a small determined shadow with his mother's eyes and his own entirely original stubbornness. Evelyn went to the garden. She got on her knees in the dirt and worked with her hands, and the sun moved across the mountains, and the creek ran below in the trees. And somewhere in the barn, Cole was talking to the horses in the low voice she could not quite hear from this distance, but had come to locate the way you located the sound of a thing you were glad to know was there. This was the life they had made, not the life anyone had planned or predicted or arranged neatly in advance. The life that had come out of the wreckage of another one, built from what was salvageable and what was new, held together by work and honesty and the particular decision made daily to keep choosing each other and this place and the difficult, ordinary, irreplaceable fact of being here. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in the end, everything.